Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for being with me today. For our devotion, we are in Galatians chapter 2. And before I share with you my personal devotional thoughts that I got out of this chapter, I just want to do a little teaching, explain some things. And the first is in verse 1, where he says, "Then after an interval of 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also." Now, I said yesterday that the first chapter of Galatians and bleeding over into the second chapter here, Paul is retelling his story, his testimony, and that he had been converted on the road to Damascus about 34 AD. And in the book of Acts, in chapter 9, it seems after he leaves Damascus, he goes to Jerusalem, but Acts leaves out a 3-year period. There's a gap there that, according to Galatians, Paul went to Arabia and prepared for ministry, time with God and study. And then after those 3 years, he returned to Damascus and then went to Jerusalem for a brief visit. And that's the one that's mentioned in Acts chapter 9, verse 23. And then Paul leaves Jerusalem and goes to his home up in Turkey, where he was from originally, and Tarsus. And you'll remember in the book of Acts, after the church at Antioch exploded with growth, Barnabas leaves Antioch and goes to Tarsus and gets Paul, brings him back to Antioch, and they, along with some others, pastor that church until they are then sent out on their first missionary journey. And then in the book of Acts, after their first missionary journey, they come back to Antioch. There's controversy about how you're saved because of the Judaizers, those that in Galatians are called the party of the circumcision, that believe you have to be circumcised to really believe in Jesus, become a Jew before you can become a Christian. And they have what's called the Jerusalem Council. In Acts 15, they go to Jerusalem and discuss that issue and agree, no, you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to obey the Old Testament law to be saved. It's Jesus. That Gentiles don't have to obey the law. Well, in verse 1 of chapter 2, when he says, after an interval of 14 years, this visit to Jerusalem is what Paul's talking about, the one that's recorded in Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council. So the time that Paul left Jerusalem after his 3 years in the Arabian desert, he leaves Jerusalem, goes to Tarsus, his home, spends several years there, then goes to Antioch and pastors there. That interval between the time he left Jerusalem, went to Tarsus, then over to Antioch, and then back down to Jerusalem at the end of his first missionary journey in Acts 15, that's a 14-year time period. That's what's going on here in Galatians chapter 1. Now, we learn in Acts 15 that when Paul and Barnabas and Titus go to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, that Peter and James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of James, leader of the church, are there. But Paul tells us in chapter 2 of Galatians in verse 9 that John, the Apostle John, who wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation, was also there. So, see, none of these put the whole story together like they're trying to write a detailed account. They give us the parts that are important for us to get the story. But you get little tidbits in different parts of the New Testament. You start putting it together to get the bigger picture from just a historic narrative standpoint. So, there's that. Now, the doctrinal issue, I mentioned yesterday that it was over how you're saved. Well, look in verse 12 of chapter 2, verse 12, okay? He says, "For prior to the coming of certain men from James," is that I got the wrong verse? You ever make, yeah, I'm in the right verse. There at the end, fearing the party of the circumcision. The party of the circumcision, what is that? That are the Jews who have become believers in Jesus in the church in Jerusalem that believed Gentiles had to be circumcised in order to believe in Jesus. That without obeying the Old Testament law, and in particular circumcision, you couldn't be a real Christian. That's what's tearing up the churches in Galatia. Just like they tried to tear up the church in Antioch, that issue is dealt with. But here they won't get. Have you noticed how people who have bad theology just never quit? How heretics and cults just never quit. It's another reason this apologetics conference that's coming up here at the end of this week is so important, so you can be equipped to help people. Anyway, that's what's going on here. A lot of pressure. Even got to Peter and Barnabas briefly. Now, devotionally, what I want to share with you is verse 21 at the end of the chapter. Paul says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. Now, don't read that too quickly. Pay attention to it. What he is saying is this. If you and I obtain righteousness, being right with God, righteousness, through the law, through obeying the law, things like circumcision and the Sabbath, food laws. Today we would talk about do's and don'ts, doing good works. If we obtain righteousness through doing good and obeying the law, there was no reason for Jesus to die. In fact, Paul says he died needlessly. God forbid Jesus died needlessly. He died because we needed him to. For there is no righteousness apart from Jesus Christ. No one is righteous by keeping the law, because to be righteous by keeping the law, you must keep all of it perfectly all the time. If you break the law once, you are a lawbreaker. If you sin once, you are a sinner. Therefore, to be righteous by doing good, you must do the right thing every moment of every day of your entire life and not mess up even one solitary thing. Paul is saying, if you can be saved by doing good and obeying the law, there was no reason for Jesus to die. His death was a waste. It was needless. But we know that's not true. We need Jesus. And he's saying to these Galatians, why are you trying to revert back to the old way of trying to save yourself by obeying the law and being circumcised? No reason for Jesus to die, if that's possible. One more devotional thought is verse 20. I love this verse. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. So much we could unpack there. But the point I want to make is that in a very real way, spiritually speaking, when Jesus died on that cross, we died with him. And Jesus tells us to die to ourselves, to crucify the flesh. And our life is Jesus. Our salvation is Jesus. It's all Jesus. It's all Jesus. It's not Jesus in my good works. It's not Jesus in me obeying the law. It's not Jesus in my baptism. It's not Jesus in my church membership. It's Jesus, 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 and Jesus alone. Now, I can hear some who struggle with legalism already saying, but what about, living godly? He's going to talk about that later. But until you accept that your salvation is through Jesus and Jesus alone, and stop trying to make it about your good efforts to do right and avoid wrong and to obey the law, you're never going to understand what it means to be saved. Because this Jesus, once you're saved by Jesus, your life is all about Jesus. You belong to Jesus. As he said in verse 20, it is no longer I who live. Listen to that. It is no longer I who live. It is no longer you who live. But Christ lives in me. Christ lives in you. My life's not about me. Your life's not about you, even though we both try to make it about ourselves. It's about Jesus. It's about Jesus. And so is your salvation. It's Jesus and only Jesus. Well, that's the message for today. I'll see you tomorrow as we continue this journey through the book of Galatians, looking at chapter 3. God bless you.